The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gabrogman Taylor, and this is episode 30, Reflections on .NET with Pablo Santos and Phil Haack. In this episode, I interviewed Pablo and Phil about the journey that the .NET ecosystem has taken from its early beginnings through to the open source revolution. Some of you may know Pablo Santos from his work on Plastic ACM and the last time that he was on the show, which was episode 26. And some of you may know Phil Haack from his work at Microsoft, his work at GitHub, or his work on the .NET Foundation. Just before we begin, Pablo was on a previous episode and we do bring up a few things that we had referenced in that episode. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, it might prove useful to listen to that one too. I'll add a link to the show notes to his earlier appearance. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So thank you very much, both Pablo and Phil, for taking the time this afternoon. Well, this afternoon for me and this morning, I guess, for Phil. For those who don't know, we're all in different time zones and getting everything ready has been it's been a bit of a nightmare for me because today all of my hardware decided that's it. Today is the day that I force the update and you have to reboot everything. It's been an interesting couple of hours. But yes, thank you both so very much for taking the time to talk with me today.
My pleasure.
Sure, it's my pleasure too. Thank you for having us.
So, Pablo, people who have heard this podcast before will know a little bit about you, but I thought maybe both you and Phil could maybe introduce yourselves a little to the listeners. I know, obviously, like I say, Pablo, you've been on the show before, but I think it would be maybe a good idea for people who maybe haven't heard that episode to hear a little bit about you and a little bit about Phil and that kind of thing so that they know who we're talking about.
Okay, sure. Phil, would you mind starting yourself?
Oh, okay. I can go first. Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Phil Haack. I am currently independent, as in I started a little consulting company called Haack LLC. But most people in the .NET world will know me from when I used to work at Microsoft. I was on the teams that created ASP.NET MVC and also NuGet, which is the package manager for the .NET ecosystem. And we were among the early rise of open source within Microsoft, especially ones with permissive license and that accepted contributions back. After Microsoft, I left to join GitHub, where I started working on GitHub for Windows. As it went back to programming, so I was a program manager at Microsoft. Went back to programming, doing C# WPF, but then I was at GitHub around close to 7 years, and I became the director of engineering for client applications, which was pretty much everything that wasn't in the browser. So the text editor, Atom text editor, the GitHub desktop product, Electron, and extensions to Visual Studio and Unity. And that's it. Go ahead, Pablo.
Okay, so I'm Pablo Santos. I'm the founder and CTO at Plastic SCM. We've been in business for the last 14 years, and we develop a version control system, Plastic, in fact. So, my job is basically wearing many different hats. I do a lot of things from development to designing new stuff, a little bit of content creation, and so on. And our main challenge is basically to continue giving something good enough for all the teams out there, giving a good alternative to the excellent, version control alternatives, especially the free ones that you can find in the market. And that's basically what we are obsessed with.
And I should probably add, so the reason that Pablo and I are together on this show is that Plastic SCM is one of my clients. I'm an advisor to them. And, we've been looking at, what does it mean for their product to live in a world where Git is so dominant? And, they do things that really well that Git doesn't. And so I'm kind of excited to, think through that. They're not here to, destroy or replace Git, but, the world's a big place, and I think there's a lot of room for different ideas about what version control could be.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, we don't get innovation in the marketplace without having, I think, maybe competitors. I'm not sure that's the correct term, but yeah, by having competition, you're able to innovate faster, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's that's our goal, right? And our key idea with that, because at the end of the day, there's no single solution every developer is going to go with. It's a big challenge for us as a small team to actually try to come up with something good to compete with, the Gits and Perforces of the world and all that. But at the same time, we feel we are doing, something super exciting, because we are basically giving choices to teams, right? So it's not like single solution for everyone. It's like really having different choices and different ways to understand development.
What I thought that we could maybe talk about today is both of your impressions of the .NET ecosystem having sort of evolved from, Pablo, you started Plastic SCM in .NET before cross-platform .NET was really a thing. And obviously, Phil, you were working as a program manager at Microsoft in the earlier days of .NET. I've read that you've obviously worked on ASP.NET Classic and NuGet. So I was wondering if we could talk about your perspectives on how everything has evolved since then. I know that you mentioned earlier on, Phil, about being one of the key proponents of the sort of open source renaissance, I guess you could say, in Microsoft. So I was wondering if we could lead with that. Like, how do you feel personally 10, 15, maybe years on, Phil, about the everything now being an open source Microsoft versus and I hope not to be political or scary about this, but a lot of people saw Microsoft as like the closed source, big, scary monster, and not so much now. How has that come about? How do you feel about that kind of thing?
I mean, I feel great. Like, yeah, there were many people within Microsoft, even in those days, who rejected the Linux is a cancer view model. That did I just say view model? Oh my god, the view that Steve Ballmer said, and a lot of us saw it as inevitable. We saw the direction that the software industry as a whole was going, and saw that open source as a core component of the business model was necessary. And I think one of the things that really bears that out is as Microsoft has moved a lot of its primary business model over to Azure and the cloud, it's become essential. Like the closed source model doesn't really work that well for them to charge or to keep a web framework closed when there's so many great alternatives. And when you look at their business model, they're selling compute. They don't really care, nor should they, what you're running on there. I mean, other than they don't want you to run anything bad or Bitcoin miners. But what they care about is that you're using their platform, right? And so if open source means that they can get more people on Azure, more people being productive, that's good for them. Way back then, I remember Hanselman used to use the super tanker analogy. Scott Hanselman, who continues to work at Microsoft, he would often say, like, Microsoft's like a super tanker. It's a giant company. It's turning, but it will take a lot of time and sustained pressure. And I think we've seen the result of that constant pressure. I think the super tanker certainly was accelerated with the rise of folks like Satya and Guthrie, along with him to high ranks at Microsoft. And I think it's great. I do see a lot of people who are like, oh, well, Microsoft has this history of bad behavior in the past, embrace and extend and all that. And, yeah, we are talking about a very large company with a very long history. I think the difference is, we have new leaders in place, and more importantly, you look at like how their incentives are aligned with their behavior now. Like back then when their whole business plan was on Windows, dominance, like of course it embrace and extend aligned with their incentives, but that's no longer the case. That just doesn't make any business sense for them to take that approach. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like, this move to open source has been really genuine, because it does align with their business interests.
In our case, what we can say is that it's like a exciting time to be a .NET developer because we've been using the .NET framework since 2005 when we started the company. We decided to make everything in plastic, in C# and .NET. And to be honest, we went through quite difficult times. I remember, for instance, like back in 2010 or 2011 or so, it wasn't that great to be a .NET developer. I mean, you didn't have the feeling you were just using like the cutting edge or using something super cool. And I don't know if Phil agrees on that, but it's more like you were on something that was built already just for corporations or for in-house software or something like that. I don't say .NET wasn't good because it was, but the general trend, the general feeling for on the market, my feeling is that it was like, okay, it's not the Node.js or not the super cool new thing or something. And now we are again into a very good moment because .NET is more active than ever. There are many more new projects and and a bigger open source ecosystem, and then the .NET Core and now the Net 5 thing coming, really trying to push for cross-platform applications. So for us, it's like a dream come true because when we started, we only went for .NET because Mono existed. We always thought we needed a cross-platform solution. We need to build plastic cross-platform. So we only went ahead because, okay, we love C# and .NET, but because Mono was there. So we always dream about, okay, what if Microsoft has .NET everywhere, really running everywhere? And we always said, okay, but they were never going to make it for Linux or the Mac or something like that. And now it's true, right? Now it's reality. So it's amazing times for us.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. I remember before I left, Scott Hunter, who now kind of runs the program manager for all of .NET Framework, he and I used to joke, part of the problem with running on early ASP.NET and even ASP.NET MVC is that it was built on this really old code base, right? ASP.NET had been around like 13 years at the time, even longer now. And as such, it was very tied to Windows and it had accumulated a ton of cruft. We had these, what do you call it? The scaling labs, right? Performance labs that would run long-term, I'm blanking on the name. Anyways, stress test labs. They run these long-term stress tests and they would find these really obscure bugs like, oh, if you run this with, 100,000, hits a second for, 2 days, you'll run into this bug. And so now we got to fix it. And it's a bug that relates to some obscure thing about Windows or whatever. But the long story short, after 13 years of accumulating those things, like we couldn't make it fast. It was slow to change anything. Plus, we had the 10-year support contract. And Scott and I, we would joke like, we really need to build ASP2.NET, like which would be rewritten from the ground up, and it would be fast, and it wouldn't carry all this legacy baggage. And it was something that I really wanted to do, but I just didn't think we could ever like get that to happen. And and I since left, and somehow Scott Hunter, was able to kind of push that vision and help it, become a reality. And as we see, that's .NET Core, which is pretty much somewhat of a rewrite. And I think that's what's really exciting to me is that now we have this modern, extremely fast platform to build applications on, but we get to continue to use a language like C# that I really like, or if you're into F# or any of those. It's a fun time to be a .NET developer.
It really is. It really is. I remember, I think it was one of the first ASP.NET community stand-ups with Scott Hunter, Scott Hanselman, Damien Edwards, and a bunch of other people. I'm blanking on exactly who was there, but I remember that the two of the three Scotts and Damien were there, and they were talking about what's the whole point of this ASP.NET vNext thing, because I think it was still called vNext at the time. And Scott Hunter broke in with Linux servers. I want you to be able to run your ASP.NET applications on Linux servers as easy as you can on Windows servers. And I think that was kind of alluding to what you both were saying, this ease of moving to maybe a different server technology. And, going back to something that Pablo said, I've always thought that .NET was always a sort of enterprise level programming arena, sort of like a programming framework specifically for enterprise level applications that were, like you said, Phil, it was tied to Windows. You can only get so much technical debt before you have to kind of step back and go, actually, now we have to deal with this. And that's not a good thing nor a bad thing. That is, being able to step back and go, actually, I think we need to rewrite part of this or take care of this because, this long-standing bug that, like you were saying, 2 days of 10,000 requests a minute and then eventually it falls over. Well, maybe there are some real-world applications where we can't have that.
Yeah, I think it's often developers always want to rewrite things, right? And a lot of times that's actually a very poor decision. But when your fundamental assumptions change, aka, oh, we actually want this to run on Linux, then a lot of times a rewrite is in order because you have years of code written against a different assumption, which is, all we care about is Windows. So yeah, it made a lot of sense.
So what about C# then? So C# has come along in leaps and bounds in the last 10, maybe just even 10 years. But obviously it started as, I don't want to say the little programming language that could, but, it has some pretty simple beginnings from back then. And, we've all said that we like working in C#. So from a personal perspective, are there any parts of C# that you each love that you think, hey, this would be brilliant in another language, or maybe something that should be in another language that you think, oh, this should be in C#? What are your opinions on the evolution of C#, I guess?
Well, in terms of things in C# that are going into other languages, I mean, we've seen the async await, which I think actually had to start in F#, kind of gets into C#. And now, Rust is, if I heard correctly, Rust just decided on what their async await syntax is going to be. And I think that's been one of those really great innovations to come out of the .NET community. A lot of time we look at the .NET community, .NET ecosystem, and we see it adapting the innovations from other places. And I don't think that's bad at all. I mean, I think there should be a lot of sharing, and that's how good things come about, is when we have a diversity of ideas from all these different communities. But there's often a sense of, well, .NET is always adapting, taking and not actually seeding great ideas. And I think two that come to mind where .NET seeded it, async await, and then reactive extensions. Reactive extensions hasn't actually caught on in the .NET community as strongly as you might expect. But what was interesting is that in the Java community, and like, for example, especially at a company like Netflix, it's really taken off. And it's a really interesting paradigm for writing async code. I mean, as Moore's law slows down, we need better and better tools for asynchronous programming and parallel programming. In terms of what C# could adopt, I haven't really thought about that lately. C# seems to be adopting things pretty quickly from, other ideas like functional programming with pattern matching. Some of the best ideas in F# are starting to make their way into C#. One of my favorite things is, the non-nullables now, or nullable reference types, as they call it. Trying to fix Tony Hoare's $1 billion mistake in .NET. The challenge with that is that it's not something that you can just wave a wand and do and add in after the fact and not have any problems. But I think it's great that the team is, attempting to tackle it head on. But, that's the kind of thing where in, a language like F#, because it was baked in from the beginning, you get a stronger guarantee there.
From a language perspective, I think in our development, we had quite a few special circumstances that didn't allow us to adopt new features as quickly as we wanted. We have I don't know if it's a reason or an excuse, but we still compile part of the command line to Java through a very old project that is now open source and basically lets you, build to Java virtual machine code. And that prevented us to use some of the new features because they were probably not, they were not supported, right? So you try to do some stuff from .NET 3. something or some of the newest C# versions that are simply not supported, right? So that actually prevents us to explore new things in some parts of our code. And that we're a little bit constrained by that. I mean, we are free to do anything we want on the server side or the web interfaces or most of the GUIs, but some parts of the core are really using very, I will say, uh, legacy style or old style or something like that. But what I found myself doing is that the more we move forward into that thinking, or maybe the older we get, or I personally get, is like I don't get so much excited about the new things. Like, okay, I like reading about them. I like to be aware of what's new. But I remember in my early days, I was like trying to use every new feature every single day. I don't feel like that anymore right now, which I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's more like, okay, let's try to be as practical as possible, as pragmatic as possible, and really focus on really solving the problem. So uh, I always have this feeling that some of the new things you find and a little bit of syntactic sugar right now. Not all of them, right, but many of them in my case. But I might be completely biased with this limitation. Doesn't mean we are not up to date with the new things. No, I mean we love the async await. We didn't use it for a while because we were a little bit into the old async pattern, just launching callbacks and so on. But yeah, they are clearly a big advantage over that. And then of course, well, link view is not new anymore. I mean it's quite old, but I mean I'm thinking about some of the new improvements in the language. So my vision is I like to see the language is alive, but it doesn't mean as application developer we're going to use everything in the first day because it's sort of I prefer simpler code, something that everyone really can understand, that following every new trend that shows up.
Yeah, I will say this, to be fair though, like a lot of these improvements in C# are actually about making the code simpler, removing unnecessarily ceremony and boilerplate and that sort of thing. I think you're in a situation where, like, having coding against mono, for example, like you can't necessarily take advantage of the latest features, but the nice thing for you is there's this bright future with .NET 5 coming out that everything converges, and now there's this one .NET platform. So I wouldn't suggest that you adopt every new feature of the language, but at least you have the opportunity to say, well, this one will make our code even simpler, or this one will more importantly, reduce concept counts. The thing about async await is it not only simplified your code, but it kind of reduced the complexity of how you thought about asynchronous code, versus, calling all the begin awaits with the callback functions, which was really way more complex and difficult to follow. Now you have this simpler way of following. So I think, that's one of the things that really excites me about .NET 5 is for people who are doing cross-platform .NET, development on Mono or with Xamarin, they'll all be on the same page, and that should make it easy, especially for like package authors. Should hopefully make it a lot easier to write libraries that target all these platforms and not have to worry about this so much.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the other nice thing about C# in general is that many of the things you start simply using them, and you don't really even. I mean, you just don't really even realize you are coding in a much different style than 15 years ago or something. So you look at very old code that wasn't really being very active for a while, and then you notice the difference. Hey, I mean, I'll just go to spot something super old, right? But remember the array list or something like that? I mean, we don't use them anymore. Of course, you use generics there, and that's something that simply happened. It's like, it's simply better. That's super old, right? So it's not probably a good example anymore, but it's like, even if you don't do it on purpose, that's something I didn't say before, you start modernizing the code. Even it just simply happens because you read about the new things and then you start using link queue here and there, or of course the sync await is something we also introduced here and there, and many of those things. So the continuity in C#, like you can still compile the old code from 15 years ago, but you can put something super new together. I think it really makes it easy to move forward step by step.
Yeah, I think that's one of the best things about the .NET languages, in that all of the compiler versions will always compile older versions of the code, if that makes sense. Kind of like what Pablo was saying. You can take some code from 15 years ago and put it through Roslyn now, and it will still compile. the framework may have moved on and you may not be able to access the same APIs in the same way, but the code will still compile. You'll still get something at the other end, which is incredibly useful, I think, especially when, for people who come on to maybe doing a maintenance sort of role where you have to take really old code and just add a new feature to it. But then I guess you can then use, what's the principle? Is it the Boy Scouts principle of going, I have this 15-year-old code, I have to add a new feature, I can tidy up this a little bit and maybe tidy up the code around it.
Yeah, that's obviously that's true, right? And I would say that the only thing I would like to get rid of, in our case, and I don't think it will be ever possible because the null checking is like, I love the new approaches that much. I really find super buggy some of the things we did, checking for nulls or something. I know we could have done patterns to actually avoid that, but
sure. And for me, one of my favorite C# features ever is the so-called Elvis operator. Not just because of the name, because the question mark and a period next to each other do kind of look like Elvis's sort of bouffant hair. I don't know whether that's the right word, but the sort of haircut. But I love the idea of being able to do that null check, that null reference check, without having to do if object not equal to null and property not equal to null, get me the value. It just is that wonderful little piece of syntactic sugar that on first look makes it a little bit more complex. If you've never seen that Elvis operator before, it looks a little bit more complex. Why is this question mark there? Not so complex as is it the question mark bang operator in C#8? But once you get the hang of it, it makes more sense than writing 15 layers of if not null checks just to get a value of a property. In both of your opinions, what is it about C# that's allowed it to stay so fresh? Is it because it has this ability to sort of seed ideas out to the community or take ideas from the community and mix it in? Is it because most programming specs are open source, but the programming spec is open source, the compiler is now open source? Is it because of the amount of communication with the community? What is it about that, do you think, that has made C# one of the, I'd say, lingua francas, I guess, of the modern programming community?
I think I give a lot of credit to the guidance of the C# team, especially the leaders, Anders at the beginning and Mads Torgerson now, in terms of setting a strong kind of vision of what they want C# to be and what they don't want it to be, and having a clear goal of it being an approachable language. And it won't take in, just any feature. Like, they're not constantly adding things all the time where you get like a Swiss Army knife with 100 knives. It isn't all that useful. So, but at the same time, they are willing to learn from other languages and take some of the best ideas. I think it's a very curated language, and I think that's important. I do think the open source aspect, especially the fact that they're doing their design discussions on a GitHub repo and conversations there, and that Roslyn itself is open source, is really fantastic for the growth and evolution of the language, because what it means is that people feel connected and engaged in it. And they, I sometimes like going in and just reading a discussion, even if I have no skin in that particular game. But like, it's kind of exciting to see, like, an idea that you thought would be simple, and you hear all the edge cases and how deeply they think about, any new language feature. But with Rosin, they can then go quickly, even spec out. If they really like it, they could spec it out and try it in a branch, and you could actually try the feature out and see how it feels, rather than just debate it and, try to hypothesize about it. So I think they're fostering a really healthy community around the language and the language design.
Yeah, in my case, I will say that I think it's fair to say that the Microsoft team did a spectacular job all the time. Over the years they were developing C# and .NET in general, right? We can give a lot of credit to their latest move to become open source, which I think is great, and it's really re-energizing the entire thing. But my belief is that they did an excellent job over the years, even when, I said, okay, maybe around 2012, 11, something like that, it was not so trendy anymore. But I don't think it was mainly due to a technical thing. I think the language and the framework was very good. The things that probably, there were many other things, different approaches to development and so on, although their core was still very good. For me, I still remember my first approach to C sharp. Before I was doing some C++ programming and Java programming for a while. I also developed in Delphi, the Object Pascal thing, from the same creator, if I'm not mistaken, the .NET. So when I first moved to C sharp and .NET, I got this magic feeling that, everything works the first time you try, right? That's first try. And it was never like that, at least not for me, with C++, right? It was like, okay, you run something, then it doesn't build, or it doesn't work as you expected or something, then you try again, even for the smallest thing. I mean, C sharp, everything's so smooth, and I think I never lost that feeling. And probably I now somehow take it for granted because it's like so many years on C sharp. But I think that's one of the magic things for the language for me. I mean, everything is just in the right place. And then, of course, over the last years, and as Phil said, all these open meetings they host and so on. That's super good to see that they are taking nice things from the community and also from other languages and getting ideas, and you feel it's alive. And even what I said before, even if you are not using everything on a single day, every single day, because you cannot keep that pace, it's still good to know you're on the right path. I mean, you don't want to be on a language that is dead, right? I mean, I don't think many of us want to be there. So that's super refreshing.
Great. So I guess this next question relating to C sharp is a bit potentially thorny. It relates to Java. And a lot of people over the years have sort of compared C sharp to Java, rightly or wrongly, or fairly, unfairly. That's for greater minds than mine to figure out. But what, I guess, comparing without having to get into a thorny discussion about C sharp versus Java, um, if someone came to you today and said, "Hey, we're going to start a new project and it's going to be in C sharp or it's going to be in Java, and you get to decide," would your instant reactions be, "Hey, let's use C sharp," or would they be, maybe I should investigate Java because I haven't looked at it"? Or would that be more a comfort thing, or would it be a case of, nope, it's definitely this language versus that one? Or is it more a case of, well, let's see what the problem domain is going to be and figure out, maybe Java is better at these particular problems. Maybe C Sharp has more support for these particular packages, these particular pieces of open source software. Or maybe it's a case of, well, we'll do some of the code in one language and some of the code in another language and have them communicate via web APIs or something.
I mean, I'm very biased because I've been using C sharp for so long, and we had the choice to go for Java, and we didn't go that in that direction. So, if I'm totally honest with you, I think every couple of months, I think we'll be in a better position if we had gone the Java path instead of C sharp and .NET 15 years ago. I don't know. My belief is that I'm much happier with C sharp because I love the environment. I love how it looks. I love how you code it. But it's also a matter of getting used to, right? So if someone came to me, which is the original question, and asked me, what would you choose? I will say C sharp and .NET, but I might be terribly biased. So I'd love to hear what Phil has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as engineers, as programmers, we like to delude ourselves to think that we're purely rational in our technical decisions and that we choose the right tool for the job. But I think that most of that is I'm trying to find a politer word than BSing. Or I'd say we're BSing ourselves, because a lot of these tools are sufficient for the job, right? And when I look at Java and C sharp, I think they're pretty similar in terms of the types of domains and tool and apps that you can build with them, that they're really good for that. There's certainly differences in the community. Java has been around longer and has a huge ecosystem. It's one of the top languages on GitHub. So you're going to find, especially for certain problem domains, more available libraries and that sort of thing. So if you're doing something really specialized, you might do a Java interop because there's a Java library for that you need, and there's no C# library. But I think in most cases, like, people choose the tools and the libraries that align with what they're comfortable with, what they've already known, what communities they're already a part of. And so, yeah, if I'm going to be one of the people coding and I'm working with other .NET developers, I'm going to choose C#. I'm going to try to choose C# because that's what I know. But, if I'm just going to be, like, let's say, the leader of the effort, and I'm not actually going to have to write code, like, and the existing developers are Java developers, yeah, I'll run a Java thing. I mean, I'm fine with using other tools. Like at GitHub, I led teams that were doing TypeScript, for example, and and in that case, it really felt it was kind of the right tool for the job, but it also reflected the existing skill set of the developers we had on staff, and it made a lot of sense. Less ramp up time. Then we could have chosen some sort of cross transpilation option, like using Closure Script or Elm or something. But we decided, no, we like TypeScript. We had existing JavaScript and C# developers, and it's what was comfortable for us. It's what would make us productive more quickly. Each language can find its proponents that would say it's the one true language or it's the better language. But I think it's really about where your background is and what you're comfortable with.
I like that. That seems to align with something that I read in I believe it was the Phoenix project, along the lines of, until the product is in the client's hands, then it's not making any money for them. So let's just get the product out to the client first, get them to make some money with it, and then they can get back to us about, well, maybe it doesn't do this, maybe it doesn't do that. And at that point, we can decide that maybe this new feature needs to be implemented in a different language or a different framework, or, hey, there's already an open source project which sort of handles this. Why don't we just sort of leverage that instead of writing our own?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no nothing that replaces getting something into users' hands for really learning about what it is that you should be doing.
Sure. I've always said that the customer doesn't know what they want until you give them what they don't want.
That's very true. I'll take note of that.
Please do. Please do. Okay, so we touched on the upcoming sort of combination efforts, the merging, as it were, of all of the .NETs into one .NET. I guess you could say one .NET to rule them all. But I know that we touched on how it would make maybe some of Pablo's work a little simpler. And definitely, I think, from a skill set, will make hiring and firing people, maybe not firing people, but hiring people, finding that human resource a lot easier, because you'll be able to say, hey, are you a .NET developer? Rather than, are you a Mono developer? Are you a Xamarin developer? Are you a .NET Core developer? That kind of thing. So what are your opinions on that upcoming merger?
Okay, for me, it's as I said, it's a huge opportunity because we are really invested into the .NET stack. We've been using Mono for ages, and we've been through many versions and so on. So the super nice thing to me is that if you think of .NET right now, it's a really full stack. I mean, you can do everything. I mean, you can develop really low-level code, and we have code using memory mapped files and stuff like that. And then we have super high level code doing GUIs, and then we have database code, and we have web, and now you can have even WebAssembly, and you can even have mobile, code for mobile devices and so on. So it's like you can do everything. I don't know if that was the original goal. I think it was. Some people would say it's better to have smaller specialized languages for each task. But I think from a very practical perspective, it's super good to be able to do everything on a single language. I mean, probably C# on the entire .NET, I don't know, but maybe it's a new C, right? It's something you can use for everything. Maybe one day we see all the tools done in, well, not everything, because that's not possible anymore, right? There's Rust and many others out there that are super good too. But it gives you an opportunity to really leverage your expertise on many different areas. From, as I said, a web, a desktop application, super fast performance code, stuff like that. So I think that's really good. And games, let's not forget about games. Unity alone has many, many developers using C#.
Yeah, I think the convergence is great, but like, to caution or to kind of keep expectations and reasonable, like it doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly, you're only looking at, oh, are you a .NET developer and you don't have to worry if there's Xamarin or this or that, because what we're talking about here is a convergence of the language and platform, which is great, especially if you're server side or backend or low level library developer. Any of these things, it really will reduce the number of concerns that you have in terms of, oh, like this runs differently on Mono than it does on .NET Core, than it does on .NET Framework. Like that kind of thing, for sure, it's going to reduce that. But the language and the platform is just one small part of building an application, right? If you're building mobile applications, that's a whole nother domain on top of that, right? Like understanding, okay, what's the cross-plat part? How do you interact with the controls that run on Android versus iOS? And that's a set of domain expertise on top of like just the .NET and C# part of it, that you get the benefit of experience. So if you're building mobile apps, you're still going to want to you're still going to want to find experts in that domain, right? If you're building cross-platform apps on desktop, like there's all kinds of, as Pablo could tell you, all kinds of considerations for running on different operating systems when you're trying to use, native UI controls with things. Yeah, you on top of that?
No, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just saying, yeah, you know how hard it is to have GUIs on different platforms. So yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No worries. I was pretty much done with that thought. I mean, to summarize, I am excited about the convergence, but I think we're still going to have these very deep expertise in these vertical spaces.
There are a couple of things I'd like to say. One is we're talking a lot about .NET Core and how the future .NET is going to be, but I think I failed to say how much credit the Mono team deserves. I mean, I really admire what they did over the years, everything they have achieved, and actually they proved they had the right vision, because now what they have in mind is going to be mainstream. And then I have a question for Phil. Do you think, I mean, like the next .NET, .NET 5 or something, is going to be somehow like the next Java? I mean, maybe we need, I don't know, like as a community to get, I don't know, Google to develop natively the Android thing on .NET or something like that. Before it was not an option because of being, under the Microsoft umbrella. But now that it's completely open and so on, maybe we are just seeing the next Java or something like that. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that.
I kind of hope so. Next Java in the sense of like it's a true community cross-platform framework. So I'm on the board of the .NET Foundation now, and it's one of our goals is to make the .NET open source ecosystem healthier, but also to create a little more independence of the .NET ecosystem. Even now, .NET, at least in the minds of everyone, it's very tied to Microsoft, and they see it as an extension of Microsoft. But when you dig deeper into that, you realize that they've open sourced the spec, and they have a standard, right? Whereas the Java spec is like they didn't open it to standardization committee like a standards committee like .NET did. And so things like that, make you realize that like .NET is a great platform for this because everything is open and standardized. So anyone could create their own implementation if they ever needed to. But I think that they're more and more placing it as a good foundation. It runs on all platforms, has the potential to run on any new platforms, open source. Yeah, I think it could be a really good place for future efforts like that.
I'd like to sort of echo what Pablo had said about the Mono team and, what Phil has just said about .NET itself, the ecosystem being such... I mean, I'm a bit one-sided because I've been developing in .NET related technologies since 2008. So, when I say I think it's ace, it's because I've been doing it for 11 years. But, it really is an amazing community to be in, and an amazing group of technology companies to be working alongside of. And it's like you said, Phil, everything is open. All there are open source packages, there are closed source packages. The language is open source. The standardization has happened. The compiler is open source. Everything's it's like open source for you, open source for you, open source for you. And I really like that. And I think that kind of ties in really well with. Like Pablo was saying about the work that the engineers at Mono have done, when I talked to Jim Bennett, he'd mentioned that a number of the unit tests, a large percentage of unit tests for the Mono framework were lifted and shifted into the .NET Core code base and vice versa, and it all just ran perfectly. And I don't think you'd get that if .NET as a platform was closed source. You wouldn't be able to have an open source reimplementation in the way of Mono that is it's had its teething problems. Let's not beat about the bush, but an open source platform like Mono that is a reimplementation of what was at the time a closed source platform that just works, and it works across different operating systems, and then just being able to sort of take some of that supporting code around it and sort of throw it onto a completely different implementation of that framework, and it all just work. A lot of people don't realize that with Mono coming into the .NET ecosystem comes the Mono linker, which means that you'll be able to build, platform specific executables that presumably will make your code smaller and faster and bring in all of your dependencies and tie that up with ahead of time. It's all wonderful. And I honestly don't think, because I've not been in this game for as long as either of you guys. You guys all have the experience on me on this, but I don't think there's been another programming framework that has taken that trajectory.
Yeah, I want to add so I was rambling earlier, and what I was trying to say is C# is ECMA standardized, or standardized by the ECMA. But yeah, I think a lot of, like you said, going back to the Mono community, what they've done, it shows that Miguel de Casa is a distinguished engineer over at Microsoft now, and he's, heavily involved in this new, the new .NET, and I think it really shows. And I think, when you think about the level of talent of the Mono developers and how many talented developers who are working on this platform that was trying to not only re-implement the closed source .NET back then, but also, create all these new innovations on top of that, so that they could run on small devices and things like the Meadow project comes to mind, right? Is impressive, is amazing, but you start to think about the future of, imagine that they're all working together on a single code base and not just trying to re-implement and extend, but actually, drive the whole same thing forward. I think, that shows that there'll be potential for even faster, better advances in the platform. We've seen how they're doing the benchmarking and the what do you call it, the power
Tech and Power?
Yeah, Tech and Power benchmarks. Yeah, the Tech and Power benchmarks, they're scoring great on there. There's Meadow. I mentioned Meadow. They're a company that's building an IoT board that runs .NET Standard on Mono, and you can see that down the road. You can imagine that will probably move to .NET 5 at some point. But by being .NET Standard, you don't really need to know what the underlying framework is, right? You just code against the .NET Standard. But seeing .NET running on IoT devices and the kind of thing where before, when I was at Microsoft, even never really thought about running .NET on little devices and programming, the Internet of Things with .NET. There was .NET Compact, but it was extremely kind of hamstrung, right? These are new, platforms, new arenas where we can have .NET code running that, we wouldn't have even been able to imagine that before. But now these things will be realities, and it'll be interesting to see, where the future of that takes us.
Yeah, it's exciting times. Exciting times. I remember talking to one engineer, and they were saying, "But fridges and TVs, with the Samsung's Tizen operating system supports .NET Core, means I can write an app on my Mac, push a button and it runs on my TV, and then push a different button and it runs on my phone, and then push another button, and like you said, when the Meadow devices come out, push a button and it's running on the edge. Everyone who's ever touched .NET, the amount of work that's gone into it is just quite simply astounding. So, Pablo, the last time that we spoke, you discussed that plastic SCM, a lot of the early evolution of it was kind of figuring it all out as you went along, especially, creating a source control system out of nothing. Figuring out what do these hashes mean? How do we store these files in the best way possible? How do we keep histories of the files and things like that? And especially since, you'd started the project, I actually looked into it the other day as preparation for this. It came along before Stack Overflow as well. And a lot of the younger devs, or maybe that's the wrong phrase, a lot of people who are less experienced in development won't realize that there was a time on the internet before Stack Overflow. So I was just wondering how having Phil as an advisor on the team has helped since he was, sort of brought on. Has it changed your workflow in any way, or has it just been a case of there's this huge amount of experience that we can sort of pull from and knowledge that we can sort of apply, or is it more a case of Phil's hands on and we're both gonna write this algorithm together and this kind of thing?
So in the early days when Stack Overflow was not there, we were big fans of MSDN. I remember receiving the DVDs to our office, and I was a big fan of it when I was at college too, and reading everything through MSDN, and later on Channel 9 and all that, right? So yeah, everything changed after the Stack Overflow and all that. Now, there's something interesting. I mean, if the internet connection goes down in the office, everyone knows 5 seconds later. So it's like, okay, you're always checking something online, or you always have something open on. That's a reality. Then the second thing you mentioned, okay, for us, having Phil aboard is super special. I mean, at the end of the day, we try to be a very competitive team, but we are a small team out of a small place in Spain. And for us, having the chance to collaborate and to receive the advice at the end of the day from Phil, from his experience, his overall view, it gives us a lot of value, right? From many perspectives, from business side of things to more technical stuff. I mean, just yesterday, and that's completely true. At the same time most of the same time we're talking now, we were discussing whether we should go for, Electron GUIs or not. And, it's like being able to ask that to a, very special person who already did it before and who knows all the people who's developing that. So that gives us a lot of, confidence in what the next step is going to be. So it's like, for me, a lot of times I felt a little bit like alone in terms of, having some sort of mentoring and stuff like that. And now it's like having someone who's been through this, who knows very well the version control field, who knows very well the technology we are. I mean, he developed ASP.NET, right? So, I mean, it's like really, a big opportunity for us. And I'm personally super excited. I think the entire team is, but if I talk just about myself, I'm super excited because I've been following him for like years, right? So it's like, unbelievable for me. So it's a really great experience and a really great opportunity. So I can only say good things. So.
I'm glad it's a podcast because you can't see me blushing over here.
Fantastic. Okay, so before we get on to the where can people find you section, I just wanted to, friend of the show, Arlene Andrews, asked me to pass on a question to you both. And it's not necessarily about .NET, not necessarily about C#, not necessarily about plastic SCM or any particular framework or technology. And her question was, what is the most useful thing that you've found that you haven't yet had a decent chance to talk about or to sort of introduce to someone yet? So this could be a framework, a technology, a package, a tool, even a development methodology in either software development or in real life. What is the one thing that you've maybe in the past couple of years you've gone, oh, wow, this is fantastic. I need to find a project to try this out?
There's a small thing I always love to give a try, and we did a couple of attempts, but not really gone through it, which is Wi-Fi Direct. So I love the idea of being on a train or on a plane and then do push and pulls. Okay, and I'm talking about plastic again, sorry. Push and pulls to another colleague, or you are in an event and the network is not good enough or something, just hook up the two computers together. It's not something super fancy. You can get good sound things here and there, but at the end of the day, it's somehow not that easy to make, and that's something I'm super excited about. And the second thing is file system stuff. I'm always looking into how to create some sort of file system level version control. That's something I'm super excited about. And I could continue on and on because I have many things I like to look into, not all related to technology, like, I don't know, like product management stuff. I'm currently finishing. It took too much to me, like this book, Badass Making Users Awesome, and I'm super excited about it. I'm also trying to learn a little bit about OKR. So there are like plenty of things I'm super excited about, and I'd like to have more time to learn.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat in terms of the number of things I want to play around with and try out and haven't had a chance to is immense. I mean, two things come to mind. One is I mentioned Meadow earlier. Like there's a Kickstarter campaign, and I went on it because I really want to play around with IoT. I don't yet have like sort of like the killer app or anything that I want to use it for, but like I think once it's in my hands and I can start to experiment with it, I hope I come up with some interesting ideas for like I don't know, home automation or something useful that helps people in the world. I don't know what that might be. And the other thing I want to play more around with is some of these AI and ML tools, machine learning. For example, I wrote a post where Microsoft has this really great set of cognitive services, and these are just APIs, and you can send an image and it'll classify, or you can send some text and it'll tell you the sentiment. And so I like taking that and connecting it to like the GitHub API and doing sentiment analysis on issue comments and things like that. But there's a lot. I'd like to go a lot deeper into that, and perhaps running some of this sentiment analysis on my local machine so that I could actually do sentiment analysis on larger bodies of text, or coming up with an overall sentiment score for an entire repo or entire community, and see if that is actually meaningful or useful. So experimenting with a lot of these tools, like I've been wanting to play around with TensorFlow and things like that. But those are all areas that I'm really excited about. I just haven't really devoted a lot of time to it yet.
Those are both really cool. I like all of those things. I for one, I definitely want to get into more sort of audio stuff. So I want to be able to maybe automate parts of this preparation for this show, maybe automate the editing and stuff like that. But that requires a kind of intimate knowledge of how audio works, and I don't have that yet. But going back to something that Pablo had said about maybe a file system based source control system, that would have been really helpful for me a few months ago. I was editing. I do a number of different podcast shows. I was editing some audio for one of the shows, and the app I was using crashed, and it wiped out everything. All of that. I'd hit save. Like I just imported the raw audio directly from the different apps that we use to record everything with. So the audio was not saved anywhere. This was the process of saving it to disk. I hit save and the app crashed. So if I'd have been able to do something with that, with source control, that would have been nice. But we live and learn. I really like the idea of doing machine learning stuff and sentiment analysis. I just don't feel like I'm smart enough to do it as well. So, as we're coming towards the close, then, where's the best place for listeners to find out more about both of yourselves and some of the work that you do? Twitter, maybe a blog post? I don't know. What's the best places for people to go to find out more?
Well, for me, I have a blog at haacked.com or hacked.com. And I'm also on Twitter at twitter.com/hacked. I'm pretty much hacked everywhere you go. So but if you go to Twitter or my blog, you can kind of find out more about me and what I'm up to. I've been trying to write more often, so there's a lot there to read.
Okay, in my case, they can follow me. Well, they can find me on Twitter at ps luaces, which is like my first name and then family name. And then, well, the best place probably to find things I write and things I think about version control and development and so on, and the experiences we have in the team is blog.plasticscn.com. We are not like super active. It's not like we are, overloading people with content, but we try to be, active. And we blog about many different things, from super technical stuff to things that happen to us and as developers, practices we put and we try, and how, for instance, how we moved from Scrum to Kanban recently and stuff like that. So if you want to learn more, that's the place.
Great. I'll be sure to include links to all of those resources and all the things we've talked about so far in the show notes. Just tangentially, I just want to share this really. You probably get this all the time, Phil, but I was telling my brother, who's a completely non-technical person, about this interview, and I said, I'm going to be interviewing this guy called Phil Haack, and he said, my goodness, that is the greatest name for a computer programmer ever.
Yeah, Phil is a great name for that. I agree.
Yes, indeed.
I actually tell that joke all the time at when I introduce myself at conferences, and I probably need to retire it. But what I tell people is that I care about the environment, so I recycle my jokes.
I like that. Like I said earlier on, thank you ever so much to both of you, Phil and Pablo, for taking the time to talk to me today. We're all in completely different time zones. So what is late evening for me is roughly mid-morning, I guess, for Phil, and even later evening for Pablo. It's all juggling this is quite a task. So what I want to do as well is I want to say thanks to Pablo's colleague Jordi as well for sort of helping to arrange this. It's all been a wonderful experience talking with the pair of you today. It's been absolutely amazing. Thank you ever so much.
No, thank you. And it's a pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
That was my interview with Pablo Santos and Phil Haack. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The full show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show or by clicking the link in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.